We're going to head to Chilean Patagonia. So we're going to meet Vreni Häussermann. She is a marine biologist, a Rolex laureate, a researcher at San Sebastian University. She's been studying the marine life in Chilean Patagonia since 1998, has been exploring and inventorying the benthic organisms. And in many groups, 2/3 of them are still new to science. So I can see why she's been down there ever since and continuing to explore and document and find all these amazing new things. So I'm going to bring her in now. Hey, Vreni, how are you doing?
Hi, nice to see you. Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you joining us. We were in Chilean Patagonia last night, and we were talking about insects and all the amazing new species they're finding there. So I can only imagine what you're finding in the waters.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of new species and lots of inventory still to be done.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Well, let's dive right into it. I'll duck out for a little bit. I'll let you take over, and then we'll see if we have a couple questions.
Okay, sounds great. So, well, marine animal forests are marine ecosystems where one or several species construct three-dimensional habitats, and this increases the biodiversity. So let's talk about marine animal forests of Chilean Patagonia. Actually, Patagonia consists of the largest fjord region of the world. It extends 1,500 kilometers from north to south, and the coastline has been calculated to span 2.5 times around the world, more than 100,000 kilometers. New Zealand Fjordland is so much better known. Everybody has heard of it, and it's so tiny compared to what we have in Chilean Patagonia. Also, scientifically, it's very poorly known.
Vreni, I just want to pop in for a moment. Sorry to interrupt. Did you mean to share your slides? Because they didn't come through.
Okay, let's go back to the start.
I thought I'd catch you before you got too far.
Yep. Yeah, you're totally right. Okay, where is the share? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just was so happy about starting that.
I can see why it's pretty darn exciting. Anytime you can get into the ocean is pretty darn exciting.
Yep. Okay, so now is all good?
There we go. We got it.
Okay, so well, I mean, I talked about how long Chilean Patagonia is and how small Fjordland is, and scientifically, it's only also poorly known. Until more or less recently, we didn't know that there was such a huge diversity because their first expeditions with the large boats could only explore the sediment in the middle of the fjords. And now we know that all the diversity is on the steep rocky walls, which can actually be accessed by diving, by underwater robots, but not by the means they had in the first inventory expeditions. So we know now Chilean Patagonia has a huge diversity of marine mammals and marine birds, but also marine invertebrates, which actually constitutes 95% of the biodiversity. So the question is Chilean Patagonia one region? Do we have the same or similar marine benthic invertebrates all along, or are there many different areas? Well, after more than 20 years of expeditions, we actually have a picture of how it looks like. There's still a lot missing. And here, this is one part northern Patagonia, is a defined region that is different from the central and southern Patagonian part. And it consists of really lovely forests. We have channels, fjords, hot springs. It's a beautiful area. And I want to show you some pictures first of the most iconic species. Actually, the most emblematic one, I would say, is the fjord coral, which forms coral banks only in the three northernmost fjords of Patagonia. Also, we find the species throughout Patagonia. These banks are only in this area. We still do not really know why. And these banks are really dense. They have 1,500 individuals per square meter, but they only occur on vertical or overhanging walls. As we see on this picture, the corals don't like sedimentation. In the same northern fjords, we find another unique benthic habitat builder, that is the brachiopods. They have dominated the oceans in the Cambrium many millions of years ago, but nowadays they can be found in very few areas. On the moderately steep slopes of northern Patagonia, we find the sea whips, forming nice animal forests. And in the first 15 meters, we have mussel banks. These mussel banks can be really thick and provide habitat for many other species. But if they're harvested, it can happen that the mussels cannot come back because the sea anemones that cover the ground, that settled first, eat all the larvae. So here we have the first human impacts that can be seen. Another interesting marine animal forest builder is the huge barnacle. They are building accumulations, and these barnacles are actually the largest in the world, up to 30 centimeters in length. Well, another unique forest of the northern fjords is the patches of encrusting sea anemones. So actually, we've seen now some pictures of the most interesting forests of northern Patagonia, but I think it's much better to see it in a video. So we will look at this video. The music you hear is just played by my daughter, and we can see if you recognize some of the animal forests we talked about. So here we see a really steep overhanging wall with the cold water corals. So this is really typical of the three northernmost fjords. So we finished our dive through Chile, northern Chilean Patagonia, and now we move on to central Patagonia. Central Patagonia looks quite different. It has really a harsh climate already. The forests are much smaller and windswept. We have these two large ice fields along the coast of central Patagonia, which actually show up when you're diving because you see all the sediment in the fjords. So in the central Patagonian fjords, the marine life, the benthic life, it's difficult to find a good spot to live. And so they inhabit mostly the vertical and overhanging walls. And the most iconic species actually common in the channels of central Patagonia, especially when there's strong current, are the hydrocorals. The hydrocorals form reefs in these channels that look very similar to tropical coral reefs, actually. And if we move on to other areas, we find also Gorgonian forests. So these gorgonians, there are different species in central Patagonia compared to the sea whips we saw in northern Patagonia. Here we have the bottle brush and the fan-like gorgonians, which give habitat to many other species sitting on top of them. Another interesting forest is the bryozoan accumulations, which are found in more exposed areas, but actually in the most exposed places all along the open coast, we find lots of sponges, and sponges is the group that is least known. There are actually many places the sponges are dominating, and then 2 of 3 sponges are not described. So there's a lot of work for taxonomists. The three-dimensional sponges we find in greater depth, and the encrusting sponges cover the shallow water because of all this strong wave impact. So then there are very colorful patches of different colors. You will see later in the video. And another interesting sponge are the polychaete meadows. These polychaetes grow up to nearly half a meter of length. So these are also typical for central Patagonia. So now I want to show you the video of central Patagonia, and you will see it looks quite different if you immerse yourself in this area and go diving. So as you see, there's a huge diversity in central Patagonia, especially a different diversity we find in the fjords with the glaciers and the sediment, and then in the channels and the exposed coasts with all the sponges. So there's really a lot to explore. If we go to southern Patagonia concerning marine animal forests, actually there's not that much. That's mainly the macroalgae forests, like the typical forests, you know, when you think about marine forests. But there are hardly any cold water corals or gorgonians. We actually do not know why. It's really interesting. We have so much more to understand to really know what happens in Chilean Patagonia. But on the other hand, we have a strong pressure already. We have, although there are still pristine areas, we have areas that are already heavily impacted. And the most impact, actually, besides climate change, is the aquaculture industry, which is a high impact industry. And in Chile now, overpassed the 1,000 millions of tons of production yearly. Besides that, there's also infrastructure building and artisanal and industrial fisheries that have impacts. And we've observed actually quite some mass mortalities in the last decade already. This was here in 2012, where in Comau Fjord, more or less half of the corals died after a strong algae bloom. And this hydrocoral reef actually in the same year disappeared after probably a brown tide. So we are really having problems here in Chilean Patagonia, obviously, and we have to think about what's happening and how we can prevent it. Here, what happened in 2015 and 16 during the very strong El Nino were mass mortalities of again, salmon, then sardines, mussels, jellyfish, and even whales. We found more than 360 dead whales in central Patagonia. What happened recently now in March and April was a huge brown tide in several areas of northern Patagonia. Alone in Comau Fjord, in this area, 6,000 tons of salmon died. And this was then here brought away, and lots of dirty water was left back in the fjords. So actually, well, we have to really think about how we can protect Chilean Patagonia. We need more protected areas. There's hardly anything in northern Patagonia. And well, I mean, actually, there's still a lot to do. And well, maybe there's some questions now.
Absolutely, no question. That was absolutely beautiful. You know, up here in Canada, I'm a cold water diver, but we don't get anything like that. It's shipwrecks, lots of shipwrecks, but we definitely don't get that much life. So thank you so much for taking us there. I'd like to start with a question just about protection. So you shared with us how massive of a coastline it is. How much of it is protected?
That's a good question. Off the coastline, hardly anything. Off the whole ocean in Chile, there's about nearly half of it protected. But actually, the protection is focused on areas that have been low conflict. So that's mostly open areas, actually even areas where there's hardly any fishing. So around the large islands they have, but excluding the coastline. So this is one of the problems. The central and northern Chilean coast and northern Patagonia has the least protected areas in Chile. And these are the most highly impacted areas. So actually where the conflict is, there's still the biggest challenges. And now the salmon farming industry tries to move southward into central and southern Patagonia. And so there are actually now big discussions going on where they are allowed and where not, because they're actually a third of the salmon farming concessions are in marine protected areas.
Okay, very cool. Well, I do want to encourage those who are tuning in right now, use that Q&A app, send us in some questions. We'll definitely make sure that we work some of those in. While we wait for the questions to come in, I'm curious about your equipment. You know, as a diver, always interested in what other people are using. So I'm wondering, when you hit the water, what are you diving in? Full dry suit, I imagine?
Yeah, dry suit. And if we dive in southern Patagonia, we also need dry gloves, because that's really cold. The temperatures are 4, 5, 6 degrees. Then it's really uncomfortable if you have the normal gloves. If you dive in northern Patagonia, actually, it's quite comfortable because the temperature is between 10 and 12 degrees generally.
Yeah. So in your opinion, as someone who's been there for, an extended period of time, explored the waters, you've seen changes over time. What are some of those changes that you are seeing in the biodiversity? Are you noticing when you hit different sites, maybe less life, or are things still pretty, is the ecosystem still pretty intact where you get to?
In northern Patagonia and the fjord where I've been diving for 20 years, we've seen quite dramatic changes, actually. In only 10 years between 2003 and 13, we've seen a reduction in abundance of 75% of many
Wow.
of the common species. Some species nearly disappeared. So we have some anemones we hardly see anymore. There are actually several species of decapods, of hermit crabs, of little shrimps that we don't see anymore, and most probably because of the heavily used chemicals against sea lice, which is a decapod parasite of salmon. And these chemicals have side effects, obviously, to all decapods. So we see dramatic changes, actually. The corals are now dead in half of the fjord. I think if we don't act very fast, we will lose much more still.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you hear the area described, you hear windswept and stormy, and so do you find there's many days where you're frustrated and you can't get out into the water?
Well, I mean, in the protected fjord, you can dive year round. But actually,
Yeah.
in many of the exposed areas, if you go on expedition, then of course it's a problem. You're on the boat and you want to use the time. And these places where we've seen the drone shot, for example, where you see the open ocean, then getting into the fjord, it was dead flat. I mean, that probably happens a couple of days a year. Normally, there in this area, it's so windswept, the forest basically lies on the ground. So their chance to go there is minimal. So I mean, if you have, that's why they are so little known about these exposed areas, because we can basically not get there unless you're extremely lucky. But in the inner fjords, I mean, there are places where you can always go diving.
Yeah. Awesome. Very, very cool. So I know back in 2015 and 2016, there were mass die-offs of whales, sardines, jellyfish, and mollusks, and a cause hasn't been established. Has there been more research? Is there, maybe any closer to figuring out what might have happened?
Well, I mean, our hypothesis, and we're quite sure it's correct, is that it was a red tide, because there
Yeah.
was a huge red tide in the area. There were levels measured 20 times above human toxicity level. So, I mean, if a whale ate these benthic crustaceans that they are feeding on, and they are a vector for this toxin. So if
Yeah.
they eat this, they are clearly affected. And this was exactly the closest spot to where these high toxicity levels were measured. And there was still some toxin in the whale stomachs. I mean, you cannot 100% prove it scientifically, but I think it's quite clear it was a red tide. And the problem was, in these El Nino years, we have this special climatic conditions where we have strong radiation, we have very low rainfall. And so the superficial water gets very saline and gets very warm. And this is the perfect condition for these red tides to grow. And the same happened now. It's always this time of year, March, when it happens, when you get the large red and brown tides. So what
Yeah.
happened this year was similar. We had these huge brown tides this time. Last time it was a red tide, but basically it's the same problem. It's a problem, a mixture of climate change and eutrophication.
Okay. So you were just talking about El Nino, red tide. So that's a question that just came in right now from Peter. Just wondering if those occurrences, those algal blooms, are they becoming more frequent?
Definitely. I mean, the red tides actually started appearing in Patagonia in the 80s, and then they moved slowly northward. And nowadays we have basically red tides every autumn, every spring, and they're getting more stronger and stronger with every time. So this is clearly connected to climate change and to contamination. It's not so easy. You don't only have a red tide where you have direct contamination, because in central Patagonia, where all the whales died, there's nobody living. There's no cities, no villages, nothing.
Yeah.
So it's more complicated, but definitely the tendency is clear. It gets stronger and it gets much more frequent, and it's everywhere.
Okay, so we can squeeze in one more question. This is from a grade 5 student who's tuning in. Her name's Grace. And this might be hard to pick, but she's wondering, what's the coolest, or is there a favorite species that you just love to see?
Diving?
Yeah.
Well, actually, for me, it's all the cold water corals. I mean, that's what I'm studying, and I just love them. I mean, these reefs, actually, for me, they look more pretty than the tropical coral reefs. I mean, if you're diving in such a cold water where everything's green, and suddenly you have these bright orange, red corals, I think this is totally fascinating, especially these hydrocoral reefs. They're incredible when you have the green background in these bright red corals. So this for me is the most beautiful part.
All right. Amazing. Well, Vreni, great work. It sounds like just an incredible part of the world to explore. I hope there is more of an appetite to kind of regulate that salmon farming a little bit more. And I hope to one day get down there and experience those waters. It just sounds like you could just hit dive sites for days and days and days and never get bored.
Definitely. And I mean, there's many places where nobody has ever dived before. So it's really cool from the explorer's perspective.
Yeah.
But we definitely have to find ways to regulate the salmon industry, and people should really think about which seafood they eat and do good choices, and not buy conventionally farmed salmon, for example, if this is produced this way. So there must be other ways. I mean, there are opportunities how we can do this better, and we must really start tackling this.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing your story and the research that you are doing. And I hope you can tune in over the weekend and check out more of the events.
Of course. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Excellent. Well, we'll see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
All right. So what a great presentation. And, as a diver, seeing those scenes, it just gets you excited. Can't wait to start getting out a little more now that it's warmed up a bit here in Canada. So just a shout out, as Vreni being a Rolex laureate, Rolex supports the Global Biodiversity Festival as part of its Perpetual Planet initiative, which supports individuals and organizations using science to understand the world's environmental challenge. So obviously we're incredibly grateful to Rolex for their support for the Global Biodiversity Festival.